unpacks the tactics used in the American news media. He's here with me now to talk about the state of the news media in the United States. Excuse me. Thank you, Alec, for coming onto the program.
Thank you, Cameron.
So we know that the COVID-19 pandemic has taken center stage in the world and the world's attention. How would you describe the American news media's coverage of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Extensive at first, and then took a backseat to the election. Projecting forward, I'm not quite sure how they'll cover it. The media is both a centralized and decentralized amorphous machine at the same time. So, I mean, many people have been asking, why does it feel like, or why do they perceive that the media has not been covering COVID-19 as much lately? And that's simply mainly because, one, the election was new, was more novel than COVID-19 was. We've been hearing about COVID-19 since March. And the election was more prominent, took center stage. And then two, there's beyond more infection rates or a changing infection rate. And you hear a report about vaccine, Moderna, Pfizer, AstraZeneca in the UK. The amount of newsworthy or new novel pieces of information just aren't as rapid as they were in March or April, when it seemed like we were quote unquote learning things every day.
How would you characterize the tone of the coverage for the coronavirus pandemic?
The tone, I mean, vary by media outlet and what demographic they're catering to. I think you'll get some cable news that'll probably take a slightly scarier tone, a higher tenor. MSNBC, for instance, versus Fox News, that I think will have a tendency to downplay it. Now, where's the truth in that example? Probably somewhere slightly in the middle. But I mean, help me. Is there a precise answer you're looking for here, Cameron?
I want to bring up. I want to bring up something because there was a new research study done by a Dartmouth College professor, by researchers from Dartmouth College and Brown University, saying that the majority of the U.S. Media coverage, 91% of the U.S. stories that when they were doing the research was classified as negative coverage, compared to 54% of the non-US stories about the coronavirus pandemic being labeled negative. Do you think that I'll rephrase it in a better way. Do you think that the US news media as a whole is taking a more negative tone than other countries' media?
How do they define the phrase negative? As in, the news is non-positive news? That means like the U.S. media is reporting, oh, we have people dying. It's like depressing news, or how do they define negative?
Well, here I'll read it to you. So the researchers measured negative. This is coming from Fortune.com news article. The researchers measured negativity using different methods. They would use 2 or 3 word phrases combined with machine learning to find the phrases that best predict whether the human reader will classify an article as strongly negative. The articles and transcripts fall into 3 subtopics: vaccines, case counts, and reopenings. What is your reaction to that?
So this article in Fortune is reporting that a Dartmouth study found that U.S. media seems to report more negatively on the coronavirus than European outlets. Is that correct?
So you have the U.S., UK. Hold on. So it's U.S., UK, India, Canada, and Australia. Those are the countries in this research study.
Man, I'm reluctant to draw any sort of grand sweeping thesis for why that is, just because I don't have a good understanding of the Indian media market versus the UK media market versus the United States media market. I mean, it doesn't surprise me that the US media coverage would be perceived as negative in general, but that's because negative news sells or gets more clicks. I mean, they've done psychological studies on what news drives the most traffic or shares the best on Facebook, and it's always emotional anger. So if you're keying your stories for negative or anger or outrage, that'll just inherently get more traffic, and those latent biases just become internalized within newsrooms. So a good example of this is if you're a reporter in DC or New York, and because we don't have a holistic COVID-19 response in the United States, is at the state level. If you're living in Boston or New York and you're writing stories about the southern United States in the summer, a lot of it would be negative, as in, look at the rising cases in the South. They haven't been able to get under control, quote unquote, like Massachusetts has. So I could just see the angles being much more negative, partly because that's going to do better performance-wise, better engagement, and two, I'm speculating, but because the U.S. does not have a comprehensive COVID response plan, it's at the state level, and so you have multiple different narratives of how COVID is spiking or decreasing, or what states are doing differently, versus the UK, which has a much more singular narrative. And so it's either good or it's either bad.
So you do not think it would be fair to generalize the American news media as leaning more towards a negative outlook on a major story such as this one, in comparison to other countries?
Right. If the study, I haven't seen the study, I'm perfectly willing to believe that perhaps the media is, but my gut is to think that it's more often extenuating circumstances, and not that the American media is inherently more negative than British media.
Okay.
But I'm just, speculating.
Okay. Were you going to say something at the end? Sorry, it got cut
off. No, I wanted to couch anything I said there within the total realm of subjectivity, and that I don't know, I could be wrong on this.
Okay, no worries. No worries. In one of your videos, by the way, one commenter is saying who is talking here and why. I just want to address one of the comments here. So we have Alec Bostwick, who's a New York City journalist. He has a great YouTube channel that basically examines the American news media and discusses different tactics that journalists will use and what broadcast news companies do here in the United States. So thank you for the comment, by the way. In one of your videos, you talked about COVID-19 coverage generally, and you did say that you did this video recently where you basically stated that the COVID-19 pandemic has not taken, the front page headlines due to other more newsworthy events. Why do you think that the coronavirus pandemic has not taken center stage?
I can't tell, you cut out there or you finish your sentence. Why do I think it's not taking center stage? Period?
Yeah, why is it not? Oh, I got cut off a bit, the connection. Why do you think the coronavirus pandemic has not taken center stage from March all the way till now?
Well, just because it's not always the most newsworthy thing in American culture, right? This year we had an election, for instance, that that was a very big election, however you feel about it. I think both Democrats and Republicans were very invested in the election. It was newsworthy for many, many, many people. You didn't really have that in France or the UK, for instance. So COVID was able to maintain a more newsworthy angle in other countries than in the US. Now, as perhaps the election dies down or DC politics gets less interesting to us again, and if COVID numbers continue to rise as they have been recently nationally, I think you will see it resurge within kind of the top line front page news, whether that's the segment A block on Fox News or MSNBC or on the front page of the New York Times. But it's getting to that concept that unless you like work in newsrooms, it's that counterintuitive idea that newsworthy, when you're reading the news, we all grew up assuming that what we read is automatically important, that what they would print, what we're going to put on television has got to be important because that's the news. But in reality, we have to uncouple those ideas. And that newsworthy, in order for something to be newsworthy, it needs to be novel or aberrant. It has to be outside the everyday life, which any sort of important story that sustains itself for long enough falls out of the news cycle. So, I mean, whether that's the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, climate change, because these stories may be important or may start out interesting, the narrative continues for so long that they become part of our everyday life and they no longer become newsworthy. And so they fall down on the reporting agenda. And the same thing is happening with the coronavirus. As it becomes part of our daily life, it becomes less newsworthy. And now other aberrant events or anomalies, whatever's happening in the country or around the world, suddenly take front page.
What would your message be to critics who will say that newsworthy events should important events like the wars that you mentioned should be centers, even though they're constantly ongoing events that take years, that those events should still be center stage no matter what, due to how important those events are?
Well, I think it's a problem of like almost fundamental economics of supply demand curves, and that the majority of people value not necessarily what's important, but what's interesting or new or novel. And the media and the news is a business like anything else, and it has to cater to often the majority's taste. And the majority taste is generally not going to be the most important thing. It's going to be a slightly lower common denominator. Now, you can get around this. There are entire niche publications that do focus on entirely foreign policy, for instance, and that will keep a more concentrated focus on what are we doing in Afghanistan still? What are our drones doing in Yemen or Saudi Arabia? But that's based around a subscription model because it's able to have a much more direct relation with a smaller demographic that views that type of news important. But for broad, big media outlets, they have to cater to a broad, big demographic. And that broad, big demographic generally has a lower common denominator of interest, right? Most people don't really care. We droned some guy in Afghanistan. All right, heard that before. Some guy in Iran we killed. C'est la vie. It's just kind of, I'm not saying that's right or wrong. It's just, it becomes, for most people, less important than, oh, a fly landed on the vice president's head during a debate. Wow. Or, oh, the Thanksgiving parade, the balloon hit a light post and deflated. Yeah, wow. Let's replay this for 3 days.
Do you think, and you mentioned the subscription model, like if a viewer or reader is, deeply focused on foreign policy, they can go to an outlet and subscribe. Do you think the that media outlets that rely on subscriptions will have success, will continue to have success, or not?
Well, certainly there's a tipping point. So the New York Times and the Washington Post have large enough subscription bases at this point that they will continue to grow and gives them a competitive edge, in fact, over free media now because they're very cash rich. However, the subscription model early on is very hard. That's why you see it so rarely. It's because it's very difficult to make work. Advertising is a much easier revenue model for media. But when you go with an advertiser model, you're by default making your content have to appeal to a broader base because advertisers want eyeballs. I mean, I don't know that I answered your question entirely. I mean, I think there's always room for subscriptions, but it's very difficult to do, and it's going to be a function of how large that demographic is in your theoretical market, subscriber market, and how wealthy they are, what they're interested. Does it make sense?
No, I thank you. No, it does make sense. I was just wondering because there may be there are those individuals who, like I mentioned, those critics who will say, oh, well, we should just focus on the most important events and focus on a certain area. You say that those individuals can go find subscription. I mean, find outlets that have more subscription based models. That was all. I was just wondering your perspective there.
Right. I think the solution to that is a system problem. So if you want the news to focus on truly important issues in a sustained way, become a teacher and go educate the next generation about historical events and the importance of understanding geopolitics or whatever you think is important, so that you have an entire generation that is interested in something deeper than the superficial level of some quips in a vice presidential debate. It's getting a population, electorate, to care about deeper issues. It's a system problem. It's what does our system care about? Well, they only care about topics this deep.
Okay, let's turn and segue from this to someone who, and you did a mini documentary about this person, Tucker Carlson, who has dominated the cable news scene this year. I'm going to show this quick little takeover here. Tucker Carlson, tonight, his ratings have shot through the roof. In the second quarter of 2020, he averaged 4.33 million viewers a night. This show recorded the highest ratings in cable news history. Tucker Carlson of Fox News really having a special year in terms of ratings. In your view, Alec, what does Tucker Carlson's success say about America?
What does it say about America? Well, again, like all things, I'm going to hedge, in that I think really what it says, if you look at the numbers, is that most Americans don't watch cable news, right? Because if you think about it, the highest rated cable news show in all of America averages 4.5 million views. Like, there are many, many YouTubers and TikTokers that clean that out daily, no problem. And so in reality, all things being proportional, I feel like sometimes we give excess influence to these people we see on TV, when in reality, their audiences perhaps aren't as big as we really think they are. I mean, 4.5 million people, there's 330 million in the United States. That's 1 out of every 100 million or something. No, that my math is wrong. 1 out of every 300. That's a very small percentage that's actually watching Fox News or Tucker Carlson. Now, why is Tucker Carlson, of all the cable news, the most popular? I think because he taps into, he acts as a proxy for what a lot of, I think, Americans want or feel they wish they could say, but can't. And Tucker Carlson is a very good proxy for communicating what a lot of people feel, or the attitude that they feel towards other media companies or politics in general. Tucker Carlson, for instance, makes it, if you study him in relation to Bill O'Reilly, which is what he took over from, he took that time slot after Bill O'Reilly sailed off into the sunset, so to speak. Tucker Carlson retooled the show a little bit, and it focuses more than Bill O'Reilly did on media itself. So Tucker Carlson will pursue other cable news and other reporters. So he'll go after Chris Cuomo, for instance, if he thinks Chris Cuomo is being a bit of a phony, or he thinks Chris Cuomo is being ridiculous, or this CNN segment's ridiculous, he will go after media and poke at it, not that differently, maybe ideologically differently, but with the same eye towards this is ridiculous that in some ways Jon Stewart did with The Daily Show. Jon Stewart would look at what was going on in cable news and poke fun. He would talk about media itself. And Tucker Carlson does this. Now he does this with a more political slant and less of a comedic slant. But I think many Americans like it when somebody within media is willing to sometimes call out media.
So you say that some of the influence or some of his success is maybe a little bit overstated. So you don't think that anyone really in cable news could influence an election or, you know, determine the course of American politics then?
No. I think this is the great hubris of journalists and media, to always believe we're God's gift to mankind and think we have some vast influence over the electorate, which in reality does not exist. And nobody is more willing to subscribe power to journalists and reporters than other journalists and reporters. Even if it's, oh, Tucker Carlson is terrible and he's spreading misinformation and he's ruining the American electorate. In reality, even if he was saying the worst things ever, just looking at the numbers, not that many people are listening. So it doesn't, you know, ultimately there's a disconnect between 4 million people listening to Tucker Carlson and then 80 million people voting for Biden and 75 or whatever voting for Trump. Tucker Carlson is this much. The rest, the other 150 million are making up their minds some other way. Not from Tucker Carlson.
So even though, you know, you say, I mean, he only has or that he's getting about around 4.5 million views, and that you mentioned TikTokers and others, but how does Tucker Carlson stand out in the cable news business?
Right. Okay. So it's all like subjective, right? So Tucker Carlson, relative to other cable news shows, gets a lot of views. Because let's say if you were to pick like a random MSNBC show like Chris Matthews or something, I think he went off the air, but let's just say Chris Matthews, I think he would average 800,000 views a night. So Tucker Carlson is 5x that, 500% more than an average MSNBC show. So that's a big difference. You have Tucker Carlson way up here and a standard MSNBC, so way down here. But then if you were to zoom out on that graph, I don't know if I can do this, and then put like PewDiePie is way over here in terms of audience. Does that make sense? So it's depending on like where you put that X and Y axis. So yes, Tucker Carlson has a much bigger influence than anybody on MSNBC, than Rachel Maddow or Chris Cuomo or Don Lemon. Of all the cable news, Tucker Carlson has the most influence. But of all public figures, he's still relatively small. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. So would you say then, do you think it would be fair to say that even though Tucker's number one on cable news, it's a dying medium in a way?
Yeah, so this is where, again, like, I'm going to couch everything I say, which is, you know, many people have called radio a dying medium and have said, oh, radio is going to die. And yet smart people come along and kind of innovate on radio and make things that are interesting, like Ira Glass in the 1990s shows up in Chicago and kind of retools the entire way we think about radio news programs with This American Life, and launches a style that's copied all across NPR, and now the New York Times copy. I mean, everything is now based on This American Life and the Ira Glass format that he started on radio in Chicago in the 90s. And this was after the advent of cable news. And so just as radio never died, I'm not sure I'd go so far as to say cable news is dying and is going to die completely, but it is no longer the dominant medium that it once was, perhaps in the 90s and early 2000s.
Someone in the comments section disagree. It says Tucker Carlson has a huge influence. I just thank you for all your comments. When you I know we're just to finish off with Tucker Carlson here, and we have more topics to go.
Yeah,
Tucker says that that the show is. He told the Daily Signal in an interview. You clip this in your mini doc. He says, "quote The show is successful because it is on Fox. The network is what matters most." Unquote. Do you believe that what Tucker is saying is completely true?
Yes. For cable news, 100%. And I think Tucker realizes this himself, because part of the reason that makes Fox News so popular is Fox News is really smart, is that they're ideologically right, not because they really care about being ideologically right, but because Roger Ailes and Rupert Murdoch, when they were forming Fox News, looked at the media landscape and said, everything around here tends to lean slightly left. And a lot of America is slightly right. So if we just create a news channel that leans slightly right, we're going to capture a huge amount of just the American market that has so far been unreally catered to. And so they deliberately went in and built Fox News, understanding there was a large untapped market, demographic there. And so they built this kind of right-leaning cable news channel. And so automatically, inherently, you're going to have a big audience, just because that's the only voice for kind of conservatives. I'm speaking in generalizations, but you get what I'm saying here. You have Democrats and Republicans, and Democrats have to choose between MSNBC, CNN, NBC, ABC, CBS, right? It's splitting up all, this demographic into, they now have to choose between 6 channels. The Republicans, they just watch Fox News. So Fox News gets to capture it all for the most part. So inherently, Fox News is going to have a larger audience. And then because of that, if you're part of Fox News and then you put on the primetime slot, you're just going to naturally have an advantage. You're going to be put up on a higher tier because you're going to have more people just automatically watching. And Tucker recognizes that because he's worked at MSNBC, PBS, CNN. He's seen it firsthand. He understands the importance of those cable news platforms to kind of get that audience in the door initially. If that makes sense.
Yes. In fact, it does. Wait, go ahead.
Oh, in fact, I mean, Tucker had a very similar, Tucker's been the same for a long time. And he had a show on NBC, MSNBC, in the late 2000s that was similar to the show he has now. It didn't do very well because MSNBC audience was left-leaning, and MSNBC wanted to lean even further left. And so they ended up getting rid of Tucker Carlson for precisely that reason. He didn't fit very well with their core demographic. Now he fits much better with Fox News core demographic, and because of that, he's able to excel really well. And that's why I think he appreciates, I think, as most broadcast journalism people would admit, that when it comes to cable news, who is backing you does matter.
And he does. You said it, like, who's backing you does matter. But you did mention, internet influencers and those in political digital media. How do you think Tucker would perform if he decided to go his own way and create his own independent channel?
See, I don't know. I think the landscape's changed in the last, and it's always changing. because you've seen this attempted. Glenn Beck and Bill O'Reilly come to mind, two huge broadcasters when they were at Fox News, getting millions. Bill O'Reilly was at the top of his game. And when he left Fox News, he really was not able to carry the bulk of that audience with him. I mean, yes, he has a small loyal fan base that I think he runs on BillO'Reilly.com or whatever. But we're talking droplets relative to the audience he had at Fox News. So that it did not carry over. The people that watched him on Fox News stayed with Fox News. They didn't follow Bill O'Reilly. And this seems, at least historically, to be the case with cable news and their talent. Now, is this changing? Possibly. Could Tucker be the first one to kind of break that cycle? If Tucker just went totally independent, would people follow him? First time for everything. And I'm be the first to say that, like, in many other areas, it seems to be true that the platform actually matters less. That most people will just follow the talent. Doesn't really matter where they are. If I like watching somebody or respect this, I'll find them wherever they are. It seems, for whatever reason, purely broadcast news, that's not the case. And why that's not the case, I'm not entirely sure. I think it might be partly due to demographics. People that watch broadcast cable news are just older, and so their mindset of like following talent just isn't the same as somebody our ages, where we're much more willing, we're much more platform agnostic. Yeah, forget it. I don't have to watch. I'm here to watch this person. I'll find them if they're on Medium.com or on YouTube or on the apps. Whereas somebody who's in their 60s, they're watching. Oh, they're no longer on Fox News. I don't. Whatever. I'll just keep watching Fox News. But again, I don't know. Tucker Carlson could break that cycle. He could.
Let's stick with cable news before we get into the future of broadcast journalism. And, we just talked a little bit about cable and Tucker, but in general about the cable news landscape, you did a video called "The Biggest Problem with Cable News." You said that cable news typically reports on what someone says, not what they do. What do you mean by that?
I think it's merely a subtle observation in that. Let me think of an example. A really easy one is that Donald Trump understands this really well. So when he got up there and during his 2015, 2016 campaign, and he said, "I'm going to build the wall. I'm going to build the wall." The amount of headlines and news we heard about Donald Trump saying he was going to build a wall could fill, the Library of Alexandria. The amount of follow-up reports about, like, well, what does this wall actually look like in mid-2018? And, it's just a little novella. And so many times reporters, because they're lazy, it's easier just to be, oh, well, they said this, so let's report that now. Now, to follow up and see what they actually did takes time, takes energy, and you just don't hear about it as much. So you can get away with saying things because reporters will just report it as they said it, and reporters are still fulfilling their duties because they're faithfully reporting what the person said. Now, whether what the person said was a lie or false or somewhere in between is less often important to the journalist than them merely feeling that they faithfully reported what the person said.
Does cable news have the resources still to follow up on what someone did?
Does cable news? Well, it's often not a question of do they have the resources, but of resource allocation. So it doesn't often behoove them to spend money or time following up on stuff. It behooves them to just figure out what's going on that day and cover it. So rather than being like, oh yeah, Donald Trump said he was going to build a wall, it's now 2018, let's go down to Yuma, Arizona, or Tucson and drive to Nogales, which is on the border, and take a look at this new wall. We could do that, but right now everybody's talking about the G8 summit. So let's actually talk about the G8 summit. Forget the. Does it make sense?
Yes. So you view it as a resource allocation problem, not a lack of total resources.
Yeah, it's again, it's like they could choose to do it. The reason why they often don't is because their ROI just inherently is easier just to kind of keep it topical, particularly in broadcast journalism. Now, print reporting can often do follow-up, and they have entire teams that are devoted to sticking with stories for a longer amount of time. But broadcast journalism is not very good at that. That's not to say it doesn't happen. It's just less frequent than I think everybody would like.
Lastly, our last topic here, sticking with broadcast journalism beyond cable news itself, what will the future look like for broadcast journalism?
I have no good precise answer to that, Cameron. I have known too many people that love to predict the future and then get it entirely wrong. So I'm hesitant to make any grand sweeping declarations about the future of broadcast journalism. I don't think cable news will die entirely, just like radio never died. It's certainly contracting, or I think finding. It'll be interesting to me how cable news, in particular broadcast journalism on the cable news side, which has historically been the dominant job opportunities in industry for broadcast journalists, how they reposition themselves with Trump out of office, because that's been such a news cycle and such a dominant headline force for so much of cable news and broadcast journalism. So I'll be curious how they retool their newsrooms to cover who knows what in the coming months and years. For more and more younger broadcast journalists, I don't know. I don't know if the routes will be working for ABC or NBC, or it will become more decentralized. And there was a time where broadcast journalism looked like it was heading very much towards what was called in the industry the Predator, which was a producer editor. So they would be these, which I've done many times. It's been my kind of role. Is you'd work in a newsroom and you'd be responsible for kind of finding a story, finding the subject, reporting it out, filming it, and then editing it. And you're just kind of like a one-man band. And newsrooms would hire a team of producer editors, and then they would all have stories or an assignment editor, and they would just be responsible for it. And then that content would live on websites like BuzzFeed or Bloomberg or New York Times or this or that. Or Vox. But as BuzzFeed and Vox and Vice, all these newer digital media companies contract, as we're seeing them contract, those jobs are disappearing. So I don't really know what will happen to broadcast journalism. Definitely, though, I can tell you the era of people going to journalism school or being a classical producer and not knowing how to edit video or having any understanding of cameras, that's not going to cut it. If you want to be a broadcast journalist, you have to have a pretty decent knowledge of filmmaking in a real way, because otherwise you'll be out competed by everybody else in the market buying for those jobs. If that makes sense, there's within working in newsrooms, at least in New York City, there's a big dividing line between older broadcast journalists that come from a kind of Nightline, 60 Minutes producer era that don't know how to actually edit. There's editors for that, right? Or we have cameramen for that. And that's really gone away. the expectation now for most broadcast journalists is for them to be able to do it all if necessary.
Last question on this topic. Where do you think Haps News fits in this conversation?
Oh, I don't know. I have no idea. Maybe I should ask that question to you. You're the one that turned me on the Haps News. Where do you think it leads, Cameron?
I mean, just from my perspective here, I think there's a lot of great content, and you have reporters doing really deep coverage on important political topics. We did have someone go down to the border and do some reporting there. I think this could be the future here with live mobile broadcasting. I know we've seen it through Periscope and Facebook Live, but this is a specific outlet for broadcast journalists to have success. I mean, that's just my perspective, but I was just wondering if something like this could end up being the future here.
Certainly a possibility. You mentioned Periscope and Facebook Live, which I'm at least acutely aware of Periscope, because I remember early on many people thinking Periscope was going to be an epiphany-like moment for live video, and it never really took off in a way I think a lot of people anticipated. I'm not sure why that is entirely, but it makes me less confident to make any assertions about the future of distributing video news. I mean, I think that's still very much up in the air, and how both the consumer side, where people choose to like watch broadcast journalism, right, and then where people choose to just put it.
Last question before we head on out. Is there anything else that you would like to add or say before we end the broadcast?
No, I mean, I don't think so. Just like to say, hopefully I wasn't too boring. Hopefully I was articulate enough. Hopefully a few of my answers made sense.
Where can they find you in terms of your content?
Oh, I mean, if anybody's watching this and interested in learning more about kind of the underbelly, the mechanics of media, they can go to my YouTube channel, which is @BostWiki, BOSTWIKI. Same that my Twitter is @BostWiki, Instagram BostWiki. You Google BostWiki, you'll probably find me. But yeah, just talk about what I see in the newsrooms in New York City. Having not anticipated going into journalism or media, I stumbled into it. And so I think I have, or at least I'm more willing to speak more openly about. It's more, or in a less romanticized way. How's that?
That's good. Thank you so much, Alec, for coming on to this broadcast. Thank you, everyone, for watching. Have a great night. Have a great night, and see you all.
Thanks, Cameron.